Hello friends, about the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed. And I would be really happy if you do so. Also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. Man, I thought RV camping would be a way to get away from it all, you know? Some peace and quiet. My name's Ethan, and I've been through some tough stuff. Lost my job as a construction supervisor last year, and just last month, my old man passed away. So, this camping trip was supposed to be my way of dealing with it all, finding some clarity. I took my RV and headed out to a spot I found online, a secluded area near Lake Andes in South Dakota. It was supposed to be beautiful, away from the usual campgrounds. When I got there, it was as quiet as I expected, almost too quiet. No other campers around, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. I parked the RV in a small clearing and set up camp. The first few hours were uneventful. I spent some time fishing, caught a couple of trout. I even started to feel a bit more relaxed. It was just me, the lake, and the forest. In the late afternoon, I took a walk along the edge of the lake. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no other RVs, no tents, no signs of life, except for a couple of abandoned campfires. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a quiet time of year. I went back to my RV, made myself some dinner, and sat outside, watching the sunset. As it got dark, I started a small campfire and settled into a folding chair, sipping on a beer. The sky was clear, and the stars were out in full force. Around 10 p.m., I heard something. At first, it was just a rustling sound, like an animal moving through the bushes. But it got louder, closer. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, pointing it towards the noise. Nothing. I figured it was just a deer or something, but the sound didn't go away. It was like something, or someone, was deliberately trying to stay hidden. "Who's there?" I called out. No response. The rustling stopped for a moment, then resumed, closer this time. My heart started to race. A knot of dread tightened in my chest, making it hard to breathe. My hands grew clammy. I went back to the RV and grabbed my knife, the only weapon I had on me. I knew I should have brought my gun, but I didn't want to hassle with the paperwork for carrying it across state lines. I decided to go inside the RV and lock the door. It felt safer that way. But the sounds didn't stop. They moved around the RV, circling it. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. That's when I heard the scratching, like nails on metal, on the side of the RV. I backed away from the window and held the knife tight. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Everything went quiet, too quiet. I stood there, trying to listen for any sign of movement. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang on the door. I jumped, almost dropping the knife. "Who is it?" I yelled, my voice cracking. No answer. Just another bang, this time harder. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. What do you want?" I shouted. Silence. Then a voice, low and rough, "Open the door, Ethan." My blood ran cold. An icy shiver snaked down my spine, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. My stomach clenched, and a wave of nausea washed over me. How did they know my name? I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. I glanced around the RV, looking for something, anything I could use to defend myself. The banging continued, more insistent now. I had no choice. I had to confront whoever it was. I gripped the knife and moved towards the door, my hand shaking. "All right, I'm opening the door," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I unlocked the door and flung it open, ready to strike. But there was no one there, just the empty darkness and the faint sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I stepped out, my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. I scanned the area but saw nothing. "Show yourself," I yelled. Nothing but silence. I was about to go back inside when I heard it again, the low voice, this time right behind me. "Ethan, you shouldn't have come here." I spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the voice. And there he was. A tall, gaunt man with wild hair and a scruffy beard. His eyes were sunken and dark. He was holding a machete, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't belong here," he said, taking a step towards me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. "This is my land. You and your kind are not welcome." "I'm just camping," I said, my voice shaking. I didn't know this was private property. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "It's not about the land. It's about what's buried here." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran towards the RV, but he was faster. He grabbed my arm and yanked me back, the machete raised high. I swung the knife at him, catching his arm. He howled in pain and let go of me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I bolted for the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. I could hear him outside, cursing and banging on the door. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I had to think of something fast. I looked around the RV, my mind racing. There was a can of bear spray in one of the cabinets. I grabbed it and waited by the door, my heart pounding. The banging stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then the door burst open, and he charged in, machete raised. I sprayed him in the face with the bear spray. He screamed, dropping the machete and clawing at his eyes. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I grabbed the machete and ran out of the RV, heading for the woods. I could hear him behind me, stumbling and cursing. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning and my legs aching. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. After what felt like hours, I finally stopped, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. I listened, but there was no sound of pursuit. Maybe I'd lost him. Maybe he'd given up. I didn't know, and I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I made my way back to the RV cautiously, keeping an eye out for any sign of the man, who I later learned was named Silas. When I got there, the RV was empty. He was gone. I quickly packed up my things and got the hell out of there, not looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road. I don't know what that man's deal was, what he meant about what was buried there. And honestly, I don't care. All I know is I'm never going back to that place again. That secluded spot near Lake Andes was supposed to be my sanctuary, but it turned into a place of terror. I'm just glad I made it out alive, though I'll carry the memory of that night with me for the rest of my life. The wilderness can be a beautiful place, but it can also be unpredictable and dangerous. And sometimes, it's the things you can't see that are the most terrifying. The wilderness has its secrets, and some of them are best left buried. I never thought I'd find myself out here, alone in the middle of nowhere, with just my RV and a dog named Jasper for company. Life's been a series of letdowns lately. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I split up, and my job as an architect had become a soul-crushing grind of endless revisions and impossible deadlines. I figured a solo camping trip in the Allegheny National Forest might help clear my head. The location was perfect, a remote spot miles away from the nearest town. I'd always loved the outdoors, and I needed the isolation to get my thoughts straight. Setting up camp, I felt the weight of the last few months lift a bit. The quiet was refreshing, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city. The towering trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. There was a small clearing where I parked the RV, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was the perfect place to escape and maybe figure out what to do next with my life. Jasper, a mutt with more enthusiasm than brains, bounded around the campsite, chasing squirrels and barking at the occasional bird. I sat by the fire, nursing a beer and watching the flames dance, feeling a semblance of peace for the first time in months. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite. As darkness fell, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. It was the kind of quiet that felt too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off and went about my evening routine, heating up some canned chili over the fire. Jasper settled down beside me, his head on my lap, eyes scanning the treeline. I decided to call it a night early and headed into the RV, locking the door behind me. Jasper curled up on the floor, and I climbed into the small bed. Exhaustion took over. The sound of snapping twigs jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was Jasper, but he was at the foot of the bed, ears perked up and alert. The noise came again, closer this time, and my heart started to race. My chest tightened, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. My thoughts scattered like startled birds, making it hard to focus. I peered out the small window, but the darkness was impenetrable. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay back down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The snapping continued, now accompanied by a low rustling sound, like something was moving through the underbrush. Jasper crawled softly, a deep rumble in his throat. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay," I whispered to Jasper as I crept towards the door. I unlocked it and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the trees, just beyond the light's reach. I took a few cautious steps forward, my breath visible in the chilly air. The noise stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence fell over the campsite. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the other side of the RV, followed by a muffled thud. I whipped around, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Jasper was barking furiously now, his hackles raised. I ran around the RV, the beam of light illuminating the scene before me. A man lay sprawled on the ground, half hidden by the shadows. He looked disheveled and dirty, his clothes torn and bloodied. He groaned and tried to push himself up but collapsed back down. I hesitated, torn between helping him and running back into the RV. My instinct screamed danger, but my conscience wouldn't let me leave him there. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, taking a tentative step forward. He didn't respond, just lay there panting heavily. I glanced back at Jasper, who was still crawling but stayed by my side. I took a deep breath and moved closer, the flashlight revealing more details. His face was battered, one eye swollen shut, and there were deep cuts on his arms and legs. "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He coughed, spitting out blood, and managed to choke out a few words. "They're coming, need to hide before." Before I could ask who they were, there was a sudden rustling from the trees, and 3 men emerged, their faces masked by bandanas. They were armed with bats and knives, and they didn't look friendly. My heart dropped, and I realized the man on the ground was running from them. "Get back in the RV." I ordered Jasper, who reluctantly obeyed. I stood my ground, flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. The men spread out, surrounding me. The leader, a tall guy with a shaved head, stepped forward, pointing his bat at me. "This ain't your business, buddy," he sneered. "Hand him over, and we'll be on our way." "Like hell I will," I shot back, adrenaline coursing through me. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." The leader laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But guts ain't going to save you." They moved in, and I knew I was outnumbered, but I couldn't let them take him, not without a fight. I swung the flashlight at the nearest guy, catching him off guard and knocking him to the ground. The others lunged at me, and chaos erupted. I slashed with the knife, feeling it connect with flesh. Someone screamed, but I didn't stop. Pain exploded in my side as one of them landed a blow with his bat. I staggered but managed to stay on my feet. Jasper barked furiously from inside the RV, and I heard the sound of paws scrambling against the door. The The leader swung his bat at my head, and I ducked just in time. I lashed out with a knife, cutting his arm. He cursed and fell back, clutching the wound. I took the opportunity to grab the injured man, Daniel, on the ground and dragged him towards the RV. The other two men were momentarily distracted by Jasper, who had somehow managed to get the door open and was now charging at them. I later found out that he managed to nudge the door lock open with his nose and push it open with his weight. I shoved Daniel inside the RV and turned to face the attackers. Jasper had one of them, Caleb, pinned to the ground, teeth bared and snarling. The third guy, Jonah, hesitated, glancing between me and his fallen comrades. I could see the fear in his eyes, and he made the smart choice, turning and fleeing back into the woods. The leader, Silas, clutching his bleeding arm, spat at me. "This ain't over," he growled before limping after his friend. I slammed the RV door shut and locked it, breathing heavily. Daniel was unconscious but still alive. Jasper licked my hand, whining softly. I patted his head, grateful for his loyalty and bravery. We stayed up the rest of the night, watching the tree line for any sign of the men returning. But they didn't come back. As dawn broke, I knew we had to get out of there. I loaded Daniel into the RV, bandaged his wounds as best as I could, and started the engine. We drove away from the campsite, my mind racing with what had just happened. It wasn't until we reached the nearest town that I called the authorities. Daniel was taken to the hospital, and I gave my statement to the police. They assured me they would investigate, but I had little hope they'd find the men responsible. All I could do was move on and try to put the experience behind me. As I drove away from the town, Jasper beside me, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering unease. The forest had been a place of peace for me, but now it held darker memories. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never forget that night in the Allegheny National Forest. It turned out Daniel was a small-time drug dealer who had crossed the wrong people. Silas, Caleb, and Jonah were part of a local gang involved in all sorts of illegal activities. They used the remote forest to conduct their business, and Daniel had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. I never saw Daniel again, but I heard he recovered from his injuries. As for me, I still go camping, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I always let someone know where I'm going, and I never underestimate the silence of the wilderness. It's a beautiful place, but it can also be a dangerous one. And sometimes, the greatest threats come not from the wild animals, but from the darkness that can reside in the hearts of men. I always preferred to be on my own when I went camping. I liked the solitude, the silence broken only by the sounds of nature. This time was no different. I had driven my RV to a secluded spot near the Rocky Mountains, a place I had heard about from an old friend, Mike. He'd raved about its tranquility and beauty. I trusted Mike's judgment. He was a fellow outdoorsman who knew his stuff. I parked the RV by a stream. The cool mountain air was refreshing, and the view was spectacular. The spot was perfect, far enough from any towns to ensure peace and quiet, but not too far that I couldn't make a quick trip for supplies if needed. I was desperate for a break. My job as a paralegal had become a soul-crushing grind, and my relationship with my girlfriend, Jenny, had recently ended. I needed to get away from the constant emails, the demanding clients, and the lingering heartache. I spent the first few hours setting up camp, collecting firewood, and setting up a fishing line in the stream. I was determined to catch my dinner. By late afternoon, I had a couple of trout cooking over the fire and a cold beer in my hand. The sky was starting to turn that lovely shade of orange and pink that signals the end of the day. That's when I noticed it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The birds had stopped singing, and an eerie silence had fallen over the area. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. I finished my meal, cleaned up, and settled into my camp chair to read a book. As the night fell, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was just getting lost in my book when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like someone stepping on a twig, but then it got louder, like footsteps. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just beyond the light of my fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. No answer. I reached for the flashlight and pointed it towards the source of the noise. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I slowly let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned back to my book, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A few minutes later, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I stood up, my heart racing, and grabbed the hatchet I kept by my chair for splitting firewood. "If someone's out there, you better show yourself," I warned. Still no answer. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, moving it slowly from side to side. My beam caught a glimpse of something, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out any details, but it was definitely a person. I felt a surge of adrenaline and fear. "Hey!" I shouted, brandishing the hatchet. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. I took a step forward, but the figure melted back into the shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest. I retreated to my campfire, deciding it was best to stay in the light. I kept my hatchet close and tried to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just some local messing with me, trying to scare the city boy. I chuckled nervously at the thought, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The way the figure moved, the way it disappeared so quickly, it didn't feel like an ordinary person. The night dragged on, and every little sound made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off in my chair. I woke up to the sound of my own snoring and the dying embers of the fire. The sky was beginning to lighten, and I felt a strange sense of relief that I had made it through the night. I decided to pack up and leave. This place no longer felt safe. As I started to gather my things, I noticed something odd. Footprints around my campsite. They were fresh and clearly human. They circled my RV, the fire pit, and even my chair where I had slept. My blood ran cold. An icy shiver snaked down my spine, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. My stomach clenched, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Someone had been watching me all night. I hastily packed up, casting nervous glances around the woods. As I was about to get into the RV, I found a note pinned to the door. It was written in shaky handwriting and read, "Leave now, or you won't make it out alive." I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped into the RV and started the engine, my hands trembling. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road. The drive back to the nearest town was a blur. I stopped at a gas station, still shaken, and told the attendant what had happened. He gave me a strange look but didn't say much. I filled up the tank and continued on my way, not stopping until I was far away from those mountains. Months later, I ran into Mike at a bar. I told him about my experience, expecting him to laugh it off or call me crazy, but his face turned serious. "You're not the first to tell me something like this," he said quietly. "There have been reports of people going missing in that area. Hikers, campers, they just vanish. The locals call it Blackwood Ridge. They say it's cursed." I laughed it off, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something terrible. I decided to do some digging online. It turned out Mike was right. There were stories, rumors, and even a few news articles about unexplained disappearances in the area around Blackwood Ridge. Some talked about a hermit, others about strange cults, and some even whispered about supernatural beings. It was all very unsettling. I still go camping, but I'm a lot more careful now. I stick to well-traveled areas, and I never go alone. The memory of that night in the Rockies, the feeling of being watched, the chilling note, it all stays with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the wilderness holds more than just beauty and peace. Sometimes it holds something far more sinister, something that's always watching, waiting for you to let your guard down. And sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones we can't see, lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, in the places where the shadows are deepest. I've always enjoyed the solitude and peace of RV camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, away from the city noise and the stress of daily life, that brings a sense of calm. But that peace I sought, it turned into a nightmare I never anticipated. My name's Jake, and this is what happened when I decided to camp near the desolate stretches of the Mojave Desert. The Mojave is a vast, arid expanse with its own rugged beauty, jagged rocks, scraggly vegetation, and the occasional coyote howl at night. It's perfect for someone looking to disconnect. I had parked my RV in a remote area, miles away from the nearest highway. It was early morning when I arrived, and I spent most of the day setting up and exploring the surroundings. There was a small hill nearby that offered a panoramic view of the desert. I hiked up there and marveled at the endless horizon. I'd been laid off from my job as a software engineer a few months back. The tech industry was brutal, and the constant pressure to perform had taken its toll. This trip was supposed to be a way to de-stress, to find some perspective. By late afternoon, I was back at the RV, preparing a simple meal. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I was content, my mind drifting as I watched the changing colors of the sky. A gentle breeze rustled the sparse vegetation, and the air was filled with the scent of sage and dust. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly. I lit a campfire and settled into a folding chair, a mug of coffee warming my hands. It was around then that I noticed something odd in the distance. Beyond the reach of the fire's light, there was a faint, flickering glow. At first, I thought it was another camper, but as I squinted into the darkness, I realized the light was moving in an erratic pattern, like someone wandering aimlessly. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the light. As I approached, I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" There was no response, just the continued flickering of the light. I finally reached a small dry creek bed where the light seemed to originate. My flashlight beam fell on an old lantern lying on the ground, its flame still burning, but there was no one around. I felt a chill run down my spine. This lantern looked ancient, like something out of an old Western movie. It was made of tarnished brass and had a heavy, ornate handle. It was out of place in the modern world. I bent down to inspect it, when I heard a rustling sound behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of a figure darting behind a boulder. My heart raced. "Hey! Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Again, no answer. The desert was eerily silent, the only sound my own heavy breathing. I slowly backed away, keeping the flashlight trained on the boulder. Just as I was about to turn and head back to the RV, something caught my eye, a dark, sticky substance on the ground, leading away from the lantern. I knelt and touched it, immediately recoiling. Blood. Fresh blood. A metallic tang filled the air, making my stomach churn. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone was injured. Maybe they needed help. But then, why were they hiding? I followed the trail cautiously, my senses on high alert. It led me to a narrow crevice between two large rocks. The crevice was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me to press on. I squeezed through the crevice and found myself in a small, hidden alcove. The beam of my flashlight revealed a horrific scene. A man, mid-30s, lay sprawled on the ground, his clothes soaked in blood. His eyes were wide open, staring lifelessly at the sky. Panic surged through me. My chest tightened, and a wave of icy dread washed over me. My thoughts scattered like startled birds, making it hard to think straight. I checked for a pulse, but it was futile. He was dead, and from the looks of it, had been for a few hours. I scanned the area, my mind in overdrive. Who was he? What had happened to him? Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned sharply, my flashlight illuminating a tall, gaunt man with wild hair and an unsettling grin. He held a long hunting knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the light. He was staring at me with a disturbing intensity. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into my soul. "Looks like you found my friend," he said, his voice calm and cold. "Too bad you won't be able to tell anyone about it." The way he said it, so casually, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My blood ran cold. I realized I was trapped. The man advanced slowly, savoring the fear he saw in my eyes. I needed to think fast. My survival instincts kicked in. I glanced around, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a loose rock nearby, about the size of a football. I lunged for it, swinging it with all my strength at the man's head. He staggered back, dazed but not down. I took the chance to dash past him, squeezing back through the crevice. I ran as fast as I could, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear him behind me, cursing and stumbling. My RV was my only hope. If I could get there, I had a chance to defend myself or at least call for help. I burst into the clearing where my RV was parked, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock as I heard him pounding on the door. I grabbed the shotgun I kept under the bed, loading it with trembling hands. "Come out, you coward," he shouted, his voice muffled through the door. I didn't respond. I steadied my breathing, trying to calm my shaking hands. The door rattled violently as he tried to break it down. I positioned myself, the shotgun aimed at the door. The door finally gave way, and he stumbled in, knife raised. I fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The man, who I later learned was named Caleb, collapsed, the knife clattering to the floor. I stood there, my heart hammering, the shotgun still aimed at his lifeless body. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My peaceful camping trip had turned into a fight for survival. I kept the shotgun trained on Caleb, half expecting him to get up, but he didn't move. After what felt like hours, I finally lowered the gun. I walked outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I needed to call the authorities. My hands were still shaking as I dialed 911. When the police arrived, I recounted the events as best I could. They found the dead man in the alcove and the body of the attacker in my RV. It was all so surreal, like a twisted nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The investigation revealed that Caleb had been a drifter with a history of violence. The man in the alcove was a fellow camper who had the misfortune of crossing paths with him. They believed the lantern was a lure, set to attract unsuspecting victims. It was a twisted game he played, hunting people for sport. He had rigged it to flicker, mimicking a lost or injured person, drawing people in like moths to a flame. I gave my statement, cooperated with the authorities, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I was allowed to leave. The sheriff, a grizzled man with a stern face, gave me a pat on the shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he said. "Just be glad you're alive." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. I packed up my RV, the serenity of the desert forever marred by the events of that night. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been incredibly lucky. But I also knew I would never forget the faces of the men who had died, nor the terrifying encounter with the man who tried to end my life. I decided then that my RV camping days were over. There are plenty of ways to find peace and solitude without risking your life. The desert might be beautiful, but it also hides dangers that no one can predict. I'd stick to well-traveled paths from now on, and maybe invest in a good security system for the house. The wilderness held too many secrets, and some of them were better left buried in the sand. The memory of that night would always be a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones we don't see coming, and that even the most tranquil settings can harbor the darkest of evils. I always thought the best part of RV camping was the solitude, the vast open spaces, and the quiet. You could hear yourself think, which is rare these days. This particular trip was no different. At least, that's how it started. I had parked my RV in a remote spot within the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest. This place was far from any tourist trail, known only to those who sought true seclusion. The air was crisp, the silence punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of a bird. I relished these moments away from the grind of my daily life as a graphic designer. It was a chance to disconnect, to recharge. My name's Alex. Born and bred in Seattle, I always had a knack for the outdoors. This love for nature had become my escape, my sanctuary from a world that never seemed to stop demanding more of me. I'd had a rough couple of years. My long-term girlfriend, Sarah, and I had split up, and the constant pressure at work was starting to get to me. I needed this trip, this escape, more than ever. It was early morning, and the dew still clung to the grass. I was sitting outside my RV, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise through the canopy. The smell of fresh pine filled my nostrils, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. I spent the day exploring the surroundings, marking trails, and setting up some snares. It was a peaceful routine. Around midday, I decided to take a break and head back to the RV. As I approached, I noticed something odd, a small, crumpled piece of paper stuck to my windshield. It was an old map, weathered and torn, but it clearly pointed to a spot deeper in the woods, about a mile away. There was no note, no indication of who might have left it. Curiosity got the better of me. After grabbing my gear and a flashlight, I set off in the direction indicated by the map. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. The deeper I went, the darker it got, with the canopy overhead almost entirely blocking out the sunlight. About half an hour into the hike, I reached the marked spot. There, hidden beneath a cluster of bushes, was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside and decided to investigate. Inside, the cabin was in disarray. Old furniture lay broken and scattered, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. There was a strange smell, a mix of mold and something metallic, like old pennies. As I explored further, I found a trapdoor in the corner, hidden beneath a rotting rug. The door creaked loudly as I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment but then switched on my flashlight and descended the stairs. The air grew colder, and the smell stronger as I went deeper. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of what looked like preserved organs. A wave of nausea hit me, and I turned away, my flashlight beam landing on a table in the center of the room. On the table lay a set of tools, old and rusted but clearly meant for surgical use. Next to the tools was a stack of old photographs, each one showing a different person, all looking terrified. My heart raced as I recognized some of the faces from missing persons reports I had seen on the news over the years. These weren't just random disappearances, this was something far more sinister. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs snapped me out of my shock. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaked on the wooden floor above. I quickly switched off my flashlight and crouched behind the table, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the trapdoor. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped right above the trapdoor. There was a moment of silence, and then the trapdoor creaked open. I peeked around the edge of the table and saw a pair of legs descending the stairs. The person was tall and muscular, wearing heavy boots and a hooded jacket. In the dim light, I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the glint of a knife in his hand. He was scanning the room methodically, like he was searching for something or someone. He reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around the room, his eyes scanning the shelves and the table. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice me. But then he stopped, his gaze fixed on the photographs. He picked up the stack and began flipping through them, his back to me. I knew this was my chance. I silently stood up and moved towards the stairs, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. Just as I reached the bottom step, a creak under my foot betrayed me. The man spun around, his eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, we both froze. Then he lunged at me with the knife. I dodged to the side, grabbing one of the rusted tools from the table and swinging it at him. The tool connected with his arm, and he dropped the knife with a grunt of pain. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Behind me, I could hear him cursing and scrambling to follow. I burst out of the cabin and into the woods, running as fast as I could. The trees blurred past me, branches scratching in my face and arms. I could hear the man crashing through the underbrush behind me, getting closer with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I finally reached my RV, yanking the door open and diving inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then scrambled to start the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. Just as the engine roared to life, I saw the man burst out of the woods, his eyes wild with rage. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward. The man ran after me, but I quickly left him behind, speeding down the narrow dirt road that led back to civilization. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with what I had seen. I knew I needed to get to the nearest town and report what had happened. As I drove, I couldn't shake the image of those photographs from my mind. How many people had that man taken? How many more might he have taken if I hadn't found that map? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to make sure no one else fell victim to that cabin in the woods. By the time I reached the nearest town, it was late afternoon. I parked the RV and ran into the police station, my breath coming in short gasps. The officer at the front desk, Deputy Miller, looked up in surprise as I burst in, my clothes dirty and torn. "I need to report something," I said, my voice shaking. "There's a cabin in the woods, and I think there's a killer out there." Deputy Miller's eyes widened, and he quickly called for backup. Within minutes, I was surrounded by police officers, all asking me questions at once. I told them everything, from the map on my windshield to the man with the knife. They listened intently, their faces growing grimmer with every word. A search team was quickly assembled, and I led them back to the spot where I had found the cabin. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The officers moved cautiously, their guns drawn and flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. When we reached the cabin, it was exactly as I had left it. The trapdoor was still open, and the shelves lined with jars still stood in the dim light. The officers spread out, searching the area for any sign of the man. They found his tracks leading away from the cabin, but he was long gone by the time we arrived. The investigation that followed was intense. Forensic teams combed through the cabin, collecting evidence and cataloging the jars and photographs. The faces in those photos were identified, linking them to missing persons cases that had gone cold years ago. The man, it turned out, had been operating for over a decade. He would leave those maps out, almost like a breadcrumb trail, to lure in unsuspecting victims. Said he got a thrill from toying with people, making them think they were safe before striking. The manhunt for the hooded figure, who the police identified as Theodore Ted Kaczynski, continued for months. He was eventually captured hiding in a remote cabin. I stayed in touch with the detectives working the case, providing any information I could remember. The experience had changed me, but not in the way I had expected. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to make sure no one else went through what I had. I started working with local search and rescue teams, using my knowledge of the outdoors to help find missing persons and bring them home. It was a way for me to turn my terrifying experience into something positive. One day, as I was hiking a new trail with a search team, I came across another old, weathered map. It was eerily similar to the one I had found on my RV that day. My heart raced as I studied it, realizing it pointed to a location not far from where we stood. I looked around at my team, their faces set with determination. "We need to check this out," I said, holding up the map. "It might lead us to something important." The team nodded, and we set off in the direction indicated by the map. The trail was just as overgrown and difficult as the last one, but we pressed on, our flashlights cutting through the thick underbrush. As we walked, I couldn't help but wonder what we would find at the end of this trail. Another cabin? More jars and photographs? Or maybe something even more sinister? We finally reached the spot marked on the map, finding another dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. This one was larger, with multiple rooms and an even stronger smell of decay. The team moved cautiously, their guns drawn and ready. Inside, the scene was disturbingly familiar: broken furniture, layers of dust, and that unmistakable metallic smell. But this cabin held more secrets. In one of the rooms, we found a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside were more photographs, along with detailed journals documenting the man's gruesome activities. As we combed through the evidence, the reality of what we had uncovered sank in. This man had been operating for years, moving from place to place, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. The thought was both horrifying and motivating. We had to stop him. The search for Kaczynski intensified, with law enforcement agencies across the country joining the hunt. The media picked up the story, turning it into a national manhunt. Tips and leads poured in, but the man remained elusive, always one step ahead. He seemed to know the wilderness like the back of his hand, using his knowledge to evade capture. Months turned into years, and the case remained unsolved. But I never gave up hope. I continued to work with search and rescue teams, helping to find missing persons and bring closure to their families. And every time I found a new trail, I couldn't help but wonder if it would lead me back to that man, to the answers I so desperately sought. The thought both terrified and motivated me. I knew I couldn't rest until he was brought to justice. Then, one day, it happened. I received a call from Detective Morrison, one of the detectives I had worked with on the case. "Alex," he said, his voice weak. They had found him. The man had been living under an assumed name in a small town in Montana, working as a handyman. He had been arrested, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. I felt a mix of relief and anger as I processed the news. Relief that he had been caught, that he couldn't hurt anyone else. Anger that he had managed to evade capture for so long, that so many lives had been lost before he was finally stopped. The trial was long and harrowing, with survivors and family members of the victims testifying against him. I was called to the stand, recounting my experience in the woods and the discovery of the cabin. It was a difficult process, dredging up painful memories, but I knew it was necessary to bring justice for the victims. The details revealed during the trial were horrific. Kaczynski had been meticulous in his planning, choosing remote locations and luring victims with his knowledge of the area. He had kept detailed journals, documenting his crimes with chilling detachment. In the end, the man was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a small comfort to know he would never be able to hurt anyone again, but the scars of his actions would never fully heal. As I stood outside the courthouse, I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also given me a new purpose. I would continue to help others, to search for the missing, and bring them home. I was no longer just a camper seeking solitude. I had become a protector, a guide for those lost in the wilderness. And I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the same determination and courage that had brought me this far. The wilderness would always hold a sense of danger for me, but it would also be a place where I could make a difference, one search at a time. The scars of the past would remain, but they would serve as a reminder of the lives lost and the importance of never giving up hope, even in the darkest of times. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a break from the monotony of my usual routine. The idea of spending a few days RV camping in the remote corners of Arizona sounded perfect. I'd always prided myself on my independence and love for adventure, often choosing to explore places most would avoid. This trip was no different, except it ended up being a nightmare that still haunts me when I close my eyes. I'd driven out to the Mogollon Rim, a stunning escarpment offering breathtaking views of the pine-covered mountains and deep gorges. My job as a software developer had become a soul-crushing grind, and my recent breakup with Emily left me feeling adrift. I needed to get away from the constant emails, the pointless meetings, and the lingering sense of failure. The RV, an old but reliable vehicle, had been my companion on many trips. I parked it at a secluded spot, a good distance from the nearest campground, hoping to enjoy some solitude. The day started peacefully enough. I set up camp, made myself a simple breakfast, and sat outside with a book. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and the pine scent intoxicating. Around noon, I decided to take a hike down one of the less traveled trails. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, making sure I had all the essentials: water, snacks, a map, and a flashlight. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something odd. The trail was getting narrower, the trees denser. It felt like I was stepping into a different world, far removed from the serene campsite I'd left behind. The air was cooler here, and the sounds of the forest were muted. I kept going, curiosity getting the better of me, until I stumbled upon a small clearing with what looked like an abandoned campsite. There were remnants of a fire pit, a few scattered belongings, and a tent that had seen better days. Something about the scene made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like whoever had been here left in a hurry. I took a few steps closer, my mind racing with questions. Who had camped here? Why had they left in such a hurry? Suddenly, I heard a rustle behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just a deer or some other harmless creature, I decided to head back to my RV. The unease I felt was growing, and the last thing I wanted was to get lost out here. As the sun began to set as I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear faint footsteps, twigs snapping underfoot, but whenever I turned around, there was no one there. My senses were on high alert, and every shadow seemed to conceal a hidden threat. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm and rational, though it was becoming increasingly difficult. By the time I reached my RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I quickly locked the door behind me and drew the curtains. Safe inside, I took a deep breath and tried to collect my thoughts. That's when I noticed something chilling. A note had been slipped under the door. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The paper was crumpled and dirty, the handwriting barely legible. It read, "Leave now. You're not alone." My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone been following me all day, watching my every move? Panic surged through me. My chest tightened, and a wave of cold sweat slicked my palms. My thoughts raced, a jumble of fear and disbelief. Staying the night in the RV no longer felt safe, but driving out in the dark through those treacherous forest roads was equally daunting. I decided to stay, but I kept the lights off and my ears sharp for any sound. I sat in the dark, clutching a knife I had brought for cooking, listening for any sign of movement outside. Hours passed, and the forest grew eerily quiet. Then, just as I began to think I was overreacting, I heard a soft tapping on the window. Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't dare move, my eyes fixed on the window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Finally, summoning all my courage, I crawled towards the window and peeked through the curtain. A face stared back at me, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I gasped and stumbled backward, dropping the knife. The tapping stopped, and the figure outside disappeared into the night. Heart pounding, I scrambled to my feet and looked for my phone. I needed to call for help. But when I found it, there was no signal. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was completely alone, cut off from the world, with someone or something intent on terrifying me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, weapon at the ready, jumping at every sound. The minutes felt like hours, and the hours an eternity. Finally, as dawn broke, I mustered the courage to step outside. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but still holding the memories of the night before. I decided I needed to leave immediately. I packed up as quickly as possible, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting the specter to reappear at any moment. Just as I was about to start the engine, I heard a voice calling out from the trees. "Help! Please, help me!" It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. I didn't have to go far. Just a few hundred yards from my RV, I found her. She was tied to a tree, her clothes torn, her face bruised and bloodied. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Thank God you found me," she whispered. "He's coming back. Please, untie me." My hands shook as I worked on the knots, casting nervous glances around. "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "His name is Silas," she said. "He's been hunting people out here for months. He enjoys the chase. Please, we need to get out of here before he comes back." She explained how Silas had taken her from her campsite a few days ago. How he had kept her tied up, toying with her, playing some twisted game. The knots finally came loose, and she collapsed into my arms. Supporting her, we hurried back to the RV. Just as we reached the door, a loud crack echoed through the forest. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of the clearing, a rifle in his hands. He was tall and muscular, with a cruel smile that sent a chill down my spine. It was Silas. "Going somewhere?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. I pushed the woman, whose name I learned was Sarah, into the RV and slammed the door shut. Fumbling to start the engine, Carl was advancing, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, speeding away down the narrow dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him raise his rifle and fire. The back window shattered, glass spraying everywhere. Sarah screamed, and I ducked instinctively, trying to keep the RV on the road. Another shot rang out, hitting the side of the vehicle. We barreled down the road, the RV swerving dangerously. I could hear Sarah sobbing, and my own heart was pounding in my ears. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each bend in turn a potential death trap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the forest and onto a paved road. I kept driving, not daring to slow down until we reached the nearest town. I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner and cut the engine, both of us gasping for breath. I turned to Sarah, who was still crying, her body shaking with sobs. "We're safe now," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We went inside, and the waitress gave us a strange look but didn't ask any questions. I called the police, and soon we were surrounded by officers, asking questions, taking statements. Silas was eventually caught, his twisted game brought to an end. As I sit here recounting the events of that day, I still can't believe it happened. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now holds a dark shadow in my mind. But life goes on, and so do I, stronger and more aware of the dangers that can lurk in even the most serene places. I still go camping, but now, I always make sure I'm not alone, and I always keep a close eye on the shadows. You never know what might be watching you from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. The wilderness is a beautiful place, but it's also a place where the wild things are, and sometimes those wild things wear a human face. I never thought a quiet camping trip would turn into a nightmare, but that's what happened. I'm Ben, and I'm about to recount the most harrowing day of my life. Let me start by saying I love the outdoors. Growing up in Colorado, nature was my playground. Fishing, hiking, and camping were second nature to me. But nothing prepared me for what happened at Dunwich State Park. My job as a financial advisor had been crushing my soul lately, endless spreadsheets and the constant pressure to perform. I just needed to get away from it all. I had decided to take my RV out for a solo weekend trip. It had been a stressful few months at work, and I needed some peace and quiet. Dunwich, a lesser-known spot, promised seclusion, a place where I could escape from the hustle and bustle of the city, or so I thought. The drive to Dunwich was uneventful, the usual scenic beauty of pine trees and rolling hills. I arrived at my chosen campsite by mid-morning. The area was serene, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest with a crystal-clear creek running nearby. Perfect for unwinding. After setting up the RV, I took a leisurely walk around the campsite. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine and earth. I spotted a few deer grazing nearby, completely unperturbed by my presence. It was idyllic, exactly what I needed. Back at the RV, I decided to cook some lunch. As I was grilling some burgers, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone eerily silent. No birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just an unsettling quiet. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my city nerves. I was used to constant noise, so the profound silence felt strange. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take a hike deeper into the forest. The park ranger had mentioned a hidden waterfall about 2 miles in. Armed with a map, a flashlight, and my trusty hunting knife, I set off. The trail was well marked but rarely used, overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. About an hour into my hike, I found the waterfall. It was stunning. The water cascaded down into a clear, shallow pool surrounded by moss-covered rocks. I sat there for a while, enjoying the tranquility. But again, that silence. It gnawed at me, making me uneasy. Deciding it was time to head back, I retraced my steps. That's when I noticed something was off. The trail markers seemed different, almost as if they had been moved. Panic began to set in. My chest tightened, and a cold wave of nausea washed over me. My thoughts scattered like leaves in a whirlwind, making it hard to focus. I wasn't lost, but something felt wrong. As I hurried back, I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. I stopped and listened, my heart pounding. Nothing. I continued walking, quicker now. The rustling returned, louder this time. I spun around, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I gripped my knife tighter, my senses on high alert. As I approached the campsite, the rustling turned into footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I broke into a run. The RV was in sight, and I sprinted the last few yards, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and grabbed my rifle. I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Peering out the window, I saw him. A tall, burly man with a scruffy beard and tattered clothes stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the RV. He had an axe slung over his shoulder. My mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? He began to walk towards the RV, slowly, deliberately. I raised the rifle and aimed, my hands trembling. He stopped about 10 feet away, staring at me through the window. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. He lifted the axe and pointed it at me, a chilling smile spreading across his face. I fired a warning shot into the air. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step forward. I shouted at him to stop, my voice cracking. He ignored me, continuing his advance. I had no choice. I fired again, this time aiming for his leg. The bullet hit its mark, and he stumbled, falling to the ground. I thought it was over. But then he laughed, a deep, guttural laugh that sent shivers down my spine. He stood up, blood pouring from his leg, and started limping towards the RV. Desperation took over. I grabbed a knife and ran out, determined to end this. We struggled, the knife and axe clashing. He was strong, but I was faster. I managed to stab him in the shoulder, but he swung the axe, grazing my arm. Pain shot through me, but I couldn't stop. I fought with everything I had, adrenaline fueling my every move. Finally, I managed to overpower him, plunging the knife into his chest. He gasped, a look of shock and rage on his face. He collapsed, the life draining from his eyes. I stood there, panting, covered in blood. It was over. Or so I thought. As I stumbled back to the RV, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back door of the RV was open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. Stepping inside, I saw the horror. The man wasn't alone. A second figure, smaller and quicker, was ransacking the RV. He turned to face me, a knife in his hand. We locked eyes, and he lunged at me. I barely dodged, grabbing a frying pan and swinging it at his head. He staggered, giving me just enough time to grab the rifle again. I aimed and fired. The bullet hit him square in the chest. He fell, clutching his wound. I stood over him, breathing heavily. He looked up at me, a mix of fear and hatred in his eyes. He muttered something, but I couldn't make it out. He died there, on the floor of my RV. I locked the door and collapsed on the bed, my body shaking. The ordeal had lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. I called the park rangers, explaining what had happened. They arrived within minutes, securing the area and calling the police. The police questioned me for hours, taking my statement and examining the scene. They found the bodies and the evidence, corroborating my story. It turned out the men were wanted criminals, Silas and Jonah, hiding out in the forest. They had been terrorizing campers for months, and I was just their latest target. As the sun set, I sat in the RV, the events of the day replaying in my mind. I had come here for peace, but found anything but. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt like a graveyard. The rangers assured me it was safe now, but I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up my things and drove away, the memories of that day etched in my mind. I hadn't planned for any of this, but I had survived, and that's what mattered. The drive back to the city was long and quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that I had narrowly escaped death. But I was alive, and I would move on. I wouldn't let this define me. As I pulled into my driveway, I took a deep breath. I was home, safe. The events of Dunwich State Park were behind me, but they had changed me. I was no longer the same person who had left for that trip. I was stronger, more aware, and I would never forget the day I faced death in the woods. And I would definitely never underestimate the silence of the forest again. It had been a harsh lesson, but I had learned it well. Sometimes, the most peaceful places hide the darkest secrets. I always prided myself on being a guy who could handle just about anything. Growing up in a small town in Kentucky, I learned early on that life doesn't hand you anything on a silver platter. So, when I decided to take a solo RV trip to a remote part of Montana, I wasn't looking for trouble, just a bit of peace, a chance to disconnect from the daily grind. My job as a real estate agent had become a soul-sucking marathon of endless paperwork and demanding clients. I needed a break, and nature was my preferred form of therapy. My name's Jake, and this is what happened on that trip. The RV was packed with all the essentials: canned food, a cooler of beer, fishing gear, and a rifle I'd inherited from my granddad. Not that I was planning on hunting, but you never know in the wilderness. The drive took 2 days, and by the time I reached the secluded spot by the lake, I was ready for a cold one and some relaxation. The first couple of hours were bliss. The lake, which I later learned was called Moose Creek, shimmered under the midday sun. A gentle breeze rustled the pines, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the occasional splash of a fish. I set up camp, cracked open a beer, and settled into a lawn chair, feeling the tension of the past months melt away. A wave of calm washed over me, easing the knot of stress that had been residing in my chest for weeks. I was lost in the serenity when a rusty pickup truck pulled into the clearing. 2 men climbed out. The older one was tall, lanky, with a grizzled beard and eyes that didn't miss much. The younger one was shorter, muscular, with a scowl that seemed permanent. They looked like locals, maybe out for some fishing or hunting. "Hey there," the older man called out, waving. "Howdy," I replied, getting up to meet them. No harm in being friendly, I figured. "Name's Chad," the older man said, extending a hand. "This here's my nephew, Caleb." "Jake," I said, shaking his hand. "Just out here for a bit of peace and quiet." Chad nodded. "Mind if we join you? Been a while since we had some company out here." I hesitated, but only for a second. "Sure, why not? Plenty of lake for everyone." They unpacked their gear and set up a small camp a short distance from mine. We shared a couple of beers and swapped stories as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. Despite their rough exterior, they seemed harmless enough. Jed had a laid-back demeanor, and even Caleb cracked a smile now and then. They told me they were locals, knew the area like the back of their hand. Said they were expecting a delivery of some special supplies later that week. I didn't pry, figured it was their business. As dusk settled, the atmosphere shifted. Jed and Caleb had fallen silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. It was subtle, but there was an edge to their gaze that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I told myself I was being paranoid. They were probably just tired from the drive. "I'm going to hit the sack," I said, stretching and yawning. "Long drive." "Sure thing," Jed replied, his eyes still on me. "Sleep tight." I climbed into the RV, locked the door, and settled into the bed. I tried to dismiss the unease, telling myself it was just nerves, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the RV, every rustle outside, set my heart racing. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud against the RV. I sat up, straining to hear. Another thud, followed by muffled voices. My hand instinctively reached for the rifle. Quietly, I got up and peered out the window. Jed and Caleb were outside, arguing. Caleb was waving his arms, pointing towards the RV. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. They were definitely talking about me, and it didn't sound good. I decided to confront them. If they were up to no good, better to face it head on. I unlocked the door and stepped out, the rifle hanging loosely at my side. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. They both turned to me, surprise flickering across their faces. Jed recovered first, a smile spreading across his lips. "Just a bit of a disagreement," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Nothing to worry about." Caleb, however, looked like a coiled spring, ready to snap. "We don't need him here, Uncle Jed," he spat. "He's a liability." "Liability? What the hell are you talking about?" I demanded, gripping the rifle tighter. My mind was scrambling to make sense of the situation. Jed sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, Jake, it's better if you just pack up and leave now." "Not until you tell me what's going on," I insisted. Jed glanced at Caleb, then back at me. "All right," he said, his voice low. "We're not exactly here for the fishing. There's a shipment we're expecting. It's valuable, and we can't afford any witnesses." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach clenched, and a wave of nausea washed over me. My mind struggled to grasp the reality of their words. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place: the remote location, their strange behavior, the late-night argument. They were involved in something illegal, something big, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Listen, I'll leave. I won't say a word," I promised, trying to keep my voice calm. Caleb snorted. "Yeah, right. Like we're going to trust you." Jed held up a hand. "Maybe we don't have to do anything drastic. Let him go, and if he talks, we'll find him." Caleb shook his head. "Too risky." I backed towards the RV, my mind racing. If I could just get inside, lock the door, maybe I could drive away, get help. But Caleb was already moving, a knife glinting in his hand. "Stay back," I shouted, raising the rifle. Jed stepped between us. "Hold on, Caleb." "No need for that." Caleb shoved him aside. "Get out of the way, old man." In a split second, everything erupted. Caleb lunged, and I fired. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. Caleb staggered, clutching his shoulder, and fell to the ground, cursing. Roy stared at me, then at Caleb. "You idiot," he muttered, kneeling beside his nephew. "Get in the RV," I ordered, my voice shaking. "Now!" Roy helped Caleb to his feet, and they stumbled into the RV. I locked the door behind them, my mind reeling. What the hell had I gotten myself into? For the next few hours, I kept the rifle trained on them, my eyes darting to the window, expecting more trouble to arrive at any moment. But the night passed without further incident. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I wasn't waiting around to see what would happen next. "Get out," I commanded, unlocking the door. Jed helped Caleb to his feet again. "You're making a mistake," Jed said, his voice cold. "Maybe," I said. "But I'm not sticking around to find out." I backed out of the RV, keeping the rifle aimed at them. "Go, and don't come back." They staggered away, disappearing into the trees. I watched until I was sure they were gone, then hastily packed up my things. My peaceful getaway had turned into a nightmare, and I wasn't about to wait for it to get worse. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. But for now, I was just glad to be getting the hell out of there. I left Moose Creek behind, the idyllic setting now tainted by the memory of violence and fear. I knew one thing for sure, though. I'd be sticking to campgrounds with a few more people around from now on. The wilderness was beautiful, but it hid too many secrets, and some of them were best left undisturbed. I was lucky to escape with my life, but the encounter left a mark on me, a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones we don't see coming. My name's Buck Riley, Senior Forest Ranger for Black Ridge National Park. I'm 43, 6 feet tall, built like a string bean from years of hauling myself up mountains. My hair was dark brown, now it's more salt and pepper, and my face? Let's just say the sun and wind have had their way with it. My wife, Sarah, used to say I look like a young Clint Eastwood, but with tired eyes. I've been with the Park Service for 21 years, seen it all, fires, floods, even a bear or two trying to steal campers' lunches. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I'm about to tell you. It all started with a call, a Tuesday morning in late August. You know, the kind of day where the air's so crisp you think, yeah, nature's all right. I was looking over trail maintenance schedules when my radio crackled. Ranger Riley, we got a missing hiker report. Young couple, Campground C, haven't heard from him in 3 days. You're closest. I sighed, grabbed my pack, and headed out. Missing hikers? Happens all the time. Usually, they turn up, sheepish and embarrassed, within a few hours. This time, though, luck wasn't on my side. Campground C is deep in the park, bordered by these jagged cliffs and a thick, ancient forest the locals call Devil's Vale. That forest, it's got a reputation. It's always dark under those trees, and quiet, too quiet. Over the years, there's been whispers, disappearances, weird stuff. Old-timers warned about it. I used to brush it off as campfire stories. By the time I got to the couple's last known spot, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. Their tent was just sitting there, empty, unzipped like they'd left in a hurry. A few footprints led away from the site, straight into the shadowy embrace of Devil's Vale. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I radioed back. This is Riley, at Campground C, tents here, but the hikers are gone. Looks like they went into the forest. I'm gonna follow the trail. I didn't get far before the footprints just vanished. Disappeared into the undergrowth like they were never there. Frustrated, I scanned the ground with my flashlight, looking for any sign, a broken branch, anything. That's when I noticed the silence. Total, suffocating silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. And then I heard it. A low sound, almost like a growl, from deeper in the trees. My pulse quickened. Bears are rare in this area, but not unheard of. I gripped my flashlight tighter, heart hammering. The growl came again, closer this time. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. What I found next made me question everything I thought I knew about this forest. Just beyond the tree line, hidden by some hanging moss, was a cave mouth. I'd never seen it before. It was massive, looked like a wound in the earth. And those footprints? They reappeared, leading straight inside. I stood there, staring into the darkness, torn. My job was to find those hikers, but every cell in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I didn't call for backup. That's my first regret. My second was stepping into that cave alone. The air inside was colder than it should have been, a shock after the late summer heat. My breath came out in white puffs. I hadn't gone far when my flashlight beam hit something on the cave floor. Scratches, deep and jagged, like something huge had clawed its way across the rock. They didn't make any pattern, but their sheer size, whatever made them, wasn't any animal I knew. "Hello?" My voice echoed, sounding weird and distorted. It was instinct, calling out, even though I knew the chances of a friendly answer were slim to none. No answer. Just a drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere deeper inside. I felt this pressure on my chest, like before a big storm. I pressed on, my flashlight catching glimpses of bizarre formations on the walls. They weren't natural, at least they didn't look it. Strange, spiraling carvings all over the place, so intricate they seemed almost alive. I knelt down, ran my fingers over the grooves. The rock was smooth, worn by time, but the carvings were fresh, too fresh. I heard it again, that growl. Louder this time, echoing like thunder. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back. But those carvings, they felt wrong, unnatural, like I wasn't supposed to see them. I couldn't shake the feeling I was trespassing, that I'd stumbled onto something ancient, something I wasn't meant to find. And then I saw it, the first real clue. A backpack, lying against the wall, its contents spilled out. Clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight, all torn or broken. No blood, no sign of a struggle, but those claw marks were all around it, like a warning. I bent down to check the bag, saw a name stitched into it, Emily. My stomach tightened. This belonged to the woman, one half of the missing couple. I didn't get a chance to look closer. A sudden, sharp sound, like a twig snapping but way too loud, echoed from deeper inside. My flashlight flickered, the beam wavering like something had passed in front of it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The answer came in the form of a shadow. It moved at the edge of my light, too fast, too big to be human. My heart hammered. I swung the beam toward it, but there was nothing there. Just the endless cave. The silence returned, heavy, pressing down on me. I should have left then. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out. But the footprints, the ones from the campsite, they continued deeper into the cave. I couldn't abandon them, not without answers. So, I did the only thing I could. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, muttered a quick prayer under my breath, and pressed forward into the darkness. The further I went, the stranger it got. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing and twisting in ways that made no sense. My flashlight caught more carvings, but these were different, more chaotic, like whoever, or whatever, made them had been in a frenzy. The spirals twisted violently, intersecting with jagged symbols that seemed to pulse in the flickering light. I had this creepy feeling they were watching me. Or worse, leading me somewhere. The footprints split. Two sets went one way, deeper in, while another set veered off toward a narrow passage on the left. My gut told me to follow the main trail, but something about that smaller passage drew me in. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The passage was tight. I had to crouch to get through. The air got even colder, my breath fogging the glass of my flashlight. My boots crunched on something, and when I looked down, I froze. Bones. Dozens of them, scattered like trash. Most were small animals, birds, but some were bigger, unsettlingly close to human size. My pulse quickened. I scanned the area, my flashlight trembling. Then I saw it. A figure, hunched and motionless, just beyond the edge of the light. My first thought was that I'd found one of the hikers. Emily? I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. It was only when I got closer that I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a statue, or it looked like one, carved from the same stone as the cave. It was this grotesque humanoid thing, with long limbs and an expression of pure agony on its face. But what creeped me out the most were its eyes, wide and hollow, like it was staring right into my soul. I reached out to touch it, almost against my will, when a sound behind me made my blood run cold. A whisper, soft and indistinct, like wind through dead leaves. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The whisper came again, louder this time, and definitely close. Leave. The word was barely audible, but its meaning was clear. Panic set in. I backed away from the statue, nearly tripping over the bones. The passage seemed to grow tighter, the walls pressing in, like the cave was alive. I scrambled back the way I came, breathing hard, every instinct screaming at me to get out. But when I stumbled back into the main chamber, I realized the footprints, the ones I'd been following, were gone. In their place were more claw marks, deeper and more erratic than before. They covered the floor, the walls, even the ceiling. And among them, smeared in what looked like ash, were those same spirals and symbols, only now they seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I wasn't alone anymore. The moment that realization hit, my instincts went into overdrive. My flashlight beam darted across the walls, the symbols throbbing like they were alive. A low sound rumbled from deeper in the cave. It wasn't a growl, it was worse. It sounded wet, like something massive shifting through mud. Who's there? My voice cracked. The response wasn't words, but movement. Shadows flickering at the edge of my light, moving unnaturally fast, darting from wall to wall, too quick to track. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my other hand reaching for the haunting knife on my belt. I started backing toward the exit, but the ground trembled. The sound grew louder. And then I saw them. Or maybe I should say, it. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark, like embers. They weren't human, too large, too reflective, too alien. As my flashlight beam caught one of the creatures, I wished it hadn't. It stood upright, its body long and twisted, like it had been pulled apart and hastily put back together. Its skin, or whatever passed for it, was a sickly gray, stretched tight over bones that seemed to shift beneath the surface. Its face was worse. No nose, no ears, just a wide, toothy grin that seemed permanently etched there. And those eyes, those burning, unblinking eyes, were fixed on me. It didn't move at first, just stared, head tilted, like it was curious. Then it opened its mouth. The sound it made wasn't a roar or a growl, it was a scream, high-pitched and deafening, like metal on metal. My ears rang. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting the walls into chaotic shadows. I didn't think, I ran. Blindly, desperately. I bolted toward the way I'd come, the sound of claws on stone following me, growing louder, faster. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it gaining on me, the air growing colder with each step. The cave twisted in ways I didn't remember. Passages that had been wide before now felt impossibly narrow. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing in time with my pounding heart. At one point, I tripped over something soft. A pile of clothes, torn and bloodied. I didn't stop to look. The exit was close. I could see the faint light of the outside world spilling in. But just as I thought I was safe, something slammed into me from behind. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of me. A sharp pain shot through my side as claws ripped across my back, tearing through my jacket like paper. I twisted around, knife in hand, and slashed blindly. I felt the blade connect, heard a shriek of pain, and then the weight was gone. Scrambling to my feet, I sprinted for the exit, the light growing brighter. The thing didn't follow me out. When I finally burst into the open air, I collapsed, gasping, trembling. The forest was eerily quiet, the silence of the cave still clinging to me. I turned back toward the entrance, expecting to see the creature emerge, but there was nothing. Just the dark mouth of the cave, as still and unassuming as when I first found it. I should have left then, sealed the cave, called for backup. But something inside me knew this wasn't over. The claw marks on my back, the glowing symbols, the horrifying thing I'd seen, they weren't just random occurrences. This cave, this forest, was hiding something much bigger, and it wasn't going to let me walk away. The safety of the sunlight outside the cave was a joke. My knees were weak, and I was gasping for air, but there was no time to rest. I looked at the forest edge, half expecting those glowing eyes to be staring back at me. They weren't. Not yet. But I could feel them, watching, waiting. I pulled out my radio, fingers shaking. "This is Ranger Riley," I said, my voice hoarse and trembling. "I need immediate backup near Sector 4. Possible survivors, or something worse." My words felt hollow as they crackled into the static. No one answered. I scanned the forest, the weight of the silence pressing down. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. No birds, no wind, nothing but the ringing in my ears. Then I saw it. A trail of blood, dark and fresh, leading from the cave entrance into the woods. My stomach churned, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I followed the trail, knife still in hand, flashlight tucked into my belt. Even in the daylight, the blood on the forest floor was thick and all over the place, like whatever, or whoever, had left it was dragging themselves away. I prayed it wasn't Emily, but a grim part of me suspected it was. The trees grew denser as I went deeper. The trail twisted through thick undergrowth and over jagged rocks, leading to a clearing that made my heart stop. In the center was a crude structure, built from branches and rocks. It looked like a shrine, but not to anything I recognized. Symbols, like the ones in the cave, were scrawled on the rocks in what looked like blood. And slumped at the base of the shrine was a body. My breath hitched. I approached cautiously, boots crunching on the dirt. The body was twisted unnaturally, limbs bent at horrifying angles. It was a man, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. I didn't recognize him, but his torn hiking gear told me everything I needed to know. He was the other missing camper. I reached for the radio again, but before I could call for help, I heard it. The sound I'd been dreading. A deep growl, coming from the shadows just beyond the clearing. My knife felt pathetically small as I turned to face the sound, my flashlight casting frantic beams through the trees. The creature stepped into the light, even more grotesque in the open air. Its grin was wider now, stretching impossibly far, and its claws gleamed with fresh blood. But it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the woods, each one as twisted and horrifying as the first. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I backed toward the shrine. The creatures didn't stop. They moved in perfect unison, their glowing eyes locked on me. There were 5 of them now, moving with an eerie fluidity, like predators stalking their prey. I knew I couldn't fight them all. My mind raced. Then I noticed something strange about the shrine. The symbols weren't just markings, they were glowing faintly, pulsing in the same rhythm I'd felt in the cave. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to them, like they were the key to something. With the creatures closing in, I made a split-second decision. I lunged for the shrine, slashing at the blood-soaked symbols with my knife. The reaction was immediate. A deafening screech tore through the air as the creatures recoiled, their movements jerky and disoriented. The light from the symbols flared brightly, blinding me for a moment. When it faded, the creatures were gone, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the forest. My knees gave out, and I collapsed, gasping for air. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. I stumbled back from the shrine, every nerve fried. The symbols I'd slashed no longer glowed, but the air around them felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. My knife was slick with whatever had been smeared on those stones, and the coppery tang of blood filled my nostrils. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then the forest began to stir. The silence shattered as the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. The ground beneath me trembled faintly, and I realized with growing dread that the creatures weren't gone. Whatever force held them at bay had only bought me time. I couldn't stay here. I turned and ran, retracing my steps toward the cave. It didn't make sense, heading back to the place where this nightmare began, but something told me the answers I needed were still inside. Maybe it was a hunch, or maybe the symbols had done something to my mind, pulling me toward their origin. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the forest without understanding what was happening would seal my fate, and maybe everyone else's. When I reached the cave entrance, the air was colder than before, biting into my skin. The claw marks on the ground had multiplied, carving deep grooves into the stone, like they were marking a boundary. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my grip, before stepping back into the suffocating darkness. The cave was different now. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, the spirals and symbols moving like living things. My flashlight flickered erratically, the beam dimming with every step. I followed the path deeper, past the spot where I'd found the statue. It was gone, replaced by more bones and fragments of torn clothing. The low growl returned, echoing from deeper in. My heart pounded as I pressed forward, knife in hand, every step a battle against the urge to flee. Then I saw it. A massive chamber, its ceiling so high it disappeared into the shadows. In the center was a stone altar, covered in symbols that pulsed. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, covered in symbols that pulsed with a sickly red light. Around it stood the creatures, their elongated forms motionless but brimming with menace. At the far end of the chamber, slumped against the wall, was a figure. My heart sank as I recognized her. Emily. I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavern. She didn't move. I edged closer, keeping one eye on the creatures. They didn't react, but their eyes tracked me, unblinking. When I reached Emily, I dropped to my knees. She was alive, barely. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, and her eyes fluttered open weakly at the sound of my voice. "John," she rasped, her voice barely audible. It was the name on the backpack, her partner's name. "It's them, they won't stop." I glanced at the altar, its symbols glowing brighter now. Whatever these things were, they were connected to this place, to this strange, pulsating energy. If I could destroy the altar, maybe I could stop them. "I'm getting you out of here," I said, lifting her as gently as I could. She groaned in pain, but she didn't resist. The creatures remained still, their heads tilting in an eerie unison as I moved toward the exit. But they didn't let me leave. As I reached the edge of the chamber, the largest of the creatures stepped forward, blocking my path. Its grin widened impossibly, and it let out a roaring sound that sent shivers down my spine. The others began to move as well, closing in slowly. I set Emily down and turned to face them, knife in hand. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice filled with more desperation than authority. The creatures didn't stop. My mind raced as I looked around for anything I could use. Then I saw it. A crack in the wall near the altar, faint light seeping through. It was a long shot, but I had no other options. "Emily, stay here," I shouted as I bolted toward the altar. The creatures hissed in unison, their movements becoming erratic as they realized what I was doing. I reached the crack and plunged my knife into it, using every ounce of strength to widen the fissure. The cave roared like a living thing, the ground shaking violently as the altar's light flared. The creatures screamed, their forms flickering like shadows in a storm. The crack widened, and with a deafening rumble, the ceiling began to collapse. I ran back to Emily, throwing her arm over my shoulder and dragging her toward the exit. Rocks crashed around us, the cave imploding as the altar's glow faded. The creatures shrieked one final time before they were buried beneath the rubble. We emerged into the daylight just as the cave entrance caved in completely. I collapsed onto the ground, Emily beside me, both of us gasping for air. The forest was silent again, but this time it felt like peace, not menace. I don't know what those things were, or what we unleashed when we destroyed the altar. But one thing is certain, the forest holds secrets that were never meant to be found. And now they're out there. We made it out, me and Emily, but at what cost? I still don't know. Black Ridge is quiet now, too quiet. People are saying it was just a cave-in, a natural disaster. They don't know the truth. They don't know what's lurking out there in the shadows, under the trees. Sometimes, at night, I can still hear the screams, still see those glowing eyes. And I wonder if we stopped them, or just made them stronger. I wonder if those things are still out there, in the dark heart of Devil's Vale, waiting for someone else to stumble into their lair, waiting to be unleashed again. I pray to God that never happens. I pray that what we saw, what we did, stays buried in that collapsed cave forever. But some prayers, I fear, are never answered. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some evils are older than time itself, just waiting for their chance to rise again. And we, in our ignorance, we might just have given them that chance. I live with that now, every single day. And the forest? It just watches and waits.